This is William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem and the fascinating people who make it tick. Today, your host Michael Green speaks with lawyer Michael Dolan. Michael's life in the law has taken him from big city firms to country practices, 2 stints at the Law Institute of Victoria, and a decade in the UK working outside the law. Today, Michael is Special Counsel Ethics at the LIV, a role he thinks may be his most satisfying, as it brings together his decades of experience in the law, the power and mobile phone industries, and more broadly in communications. But when he first left school, Michael headed off to explore a very different type of vocation.
When I left school, I had to go and do something else, and for some time I'd been thinking about doing studies to become a Jesuit priest. I was taught by Jesuit priests at St Patrick's College, and one of them, Father Peach, was also in charge of the cadets, so I'd had quite a bit to do with him, and he was a good man and a mentor in many ways. But when I was at St Patrick's College, where a number of the teachers were in fact Jesuit priests, then inevitably in front of the boys leaving the college was always the question, do you have a vocation? Think about it. So I was the one who gave it a go. So I applied and then went to Watsonia, to the training seminary and the novitiate, and I was there for about 11 months. And at the end of that time, I had thought about it and decided this wasn't for me, and I'd like to just go back and continue my schooling at university. It was an interesting time. I met lots of interesting people, and people who went on to do all sorts of things in other walks of life. And now and again, I still see some of them.
Our guest this morning in Lives in the Law is Michael Dolan. Michael is the Ethics Special Counsel for the Law Institute of Victoria. Michael, maybe by starting, as well as welcoming you, of course, and very pleased to have you here, what do you do in this role as Ethics Special Counsel?
Thank you for having me on, Michael. It's great to be here and have that conversation. Well, yes, I can sum that up fairly easily, I think. As Special Counsel, my job is advising the profession on the ethical problems they face in daily legal practice, and also I'm involved in CPD education, presenting seminars and keeping them up to date. I assist the Ethics Committee in terms of it looking at things and coming out with rulings to assist practitioners get through those issues. And I'm part of a team there, and I work in a very small team, but that's all we do as far as I'm concerned. I'm just doing ethics.
Michael, you've had a long journey in the law, partly in the law and partly out of the law.
Correct.
So let's go back to the start, which is as good a place as any to start. How did you get into the law? Would you come from a legal family? Was there some legal background to direct you into the law?
No, there wasn't, Michael. It was an interesting thing that when I was in Year 12, I was at St Patrick's College in East Melbourne, but they had a program whereby former students of the school would come along and talk to the matriculation students, Year 12 now, as to what they'd done in adult life after they'd left the school. And one of them was Bernard Gaynor, who was a solicitor, and I'd never seen or met him before, but he was very good and explained what it was like being a solicitor and the practice that he had, etc. And then there came a time when I was thinking about what am I really going to do, and I thought, that legal one sounded really interesting. So I contacted him and said who I was and could I have the opportunity to come and have a chat to him one-on-one. And he was very gracious about that and said, yes, of course. And we talked for an hour or so and it sounded really good. And then he basically said to me, we've got a vacancy for an article clerk at the moment, doing it as a part-time course. Would that be of interest to you? And I said, thank you, Mr. Gaynor. That's very kind of you. It sounds terrific. Let me think about it for a day or two and get back to you. And I got back to him and that's where it all started. I started and worked there for 6 years.
Now, that article clerk's course doesn't exist anymore.
That was at the University of Melbourne. It did not exist. Much beyond me, I think. I was almost the last one there. They started another one at the RMIT and I had nothing to do with that one.
So explain to us, what were the nuts and bolts of the article clerk's course? What did you do and how was it different to doing a law degree at the university?
Well, it was almost identical to doing a law degree at the university, because I had to study and pass all of the law subjects that a student in the degree course would have to do. The only difference was I didn't have to do the 4 art subjects that went with it. So that was fine. So I studied exactly the same subjects. There were the same lecturers and all the references that everyone else did. But I was working part-time, so I wasn't doing it over a full-time 4-year course, but it lasted over a 6-year period. In that time, I was working at Rennick & Gaynor, which was Mr. Gaynor's law firm, working and assisting with the work there and learning from them. There were a number of partners, and they were all very good to work with and very generous with their time. So a combination of the practical things, but also jumping on the tram, going up, doing a lecture at the university, coming back down, back into file work. So that's how it worked.
Have you got any idea of how many students were doing the article clerk's course with you?
I was the only one, as it turned out.
Only one from Rennick & Gaynor, or the only one in
the only one at law school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it had fallen into disuse in just where it had been, and I found out in relation to you could apply for a small scholarship. You could do it, but I applied for it and I got it. But I found out later that there was no competition. I was the only one. So, but it was a small amount of money to help with purchasing books and that sort of thing. So, no, I think it was at that time. Later than that, the RMIT article clerk's course started, and that had nothing to do with the university, as far as I'm aware.
It surprised me when that article clerk's course at Melbourne University stopped, because I thought that it prepared you better for practice than doing a degree, because of the fact that you were working and understood the practical application of the subjects you were studying.
That's exactly what happened in my case. I mean, I was lucky to be doing it with the law degree students, but I was also lucky to be working 5 days a week in the office. But they were very generous, and part of the deal was they had to give you time off to go up. So if it was an 8 o'clock lecture, it was an early day, I would go up for an 8 o'clock lecture, and I'd be in the office at, 9:30. But then again, if I had an 11 o'clock lecture, then I'd work until it was time to go and jump on the tram, go up to the university and do an hour and come back. And I did that right through the 6 years.
Yeah, as I say, it surprises me that it no longer exists, because I remember thinking people who did that course had a far better understanding of the law than I had, as someone who did a 4-year degree than articles. But anyway, be that as it may, during this time you also joined the Army Reserve.
Yes, I did.
I thought, was part of the reason because, in fact, it paid you a little bit of money? I'm assuming as an article clerk you didn't get much money.
No, well, that's right. It wasn't a huge salary, but at the same time, it wasn't the deciding factor. I'd been in the cadets at school, and I'd ended up as the senior cadet under officer for the college. So I was very interested in it, and I was genuinely thinking about going into the Army when I left school and applying to go to Duntroon, to the officers training course, but I chose not to do that, as it turned out. And then Doug Marr, who was a fellow article clerk at Rennick & Gaynor for a 12-month article clerk, who ultimately went on to become a barrister and Queen's Counsel, was an officer in Melbourne University Regiment. And he said to me, you've been in the cadets and that, you ought to come along. I'll take you up to Carlton one night and see what it's like. And that was the end of that. I signed up for that.
And how did that lead on to the most important partnership in your life?
Well, when I was a couple of years into it, we were up at Puckapunyal for a 2-week camp, and I was in what was called the signal platoon, dealing with radio communications. And we had a situation where platoon commander and another warrant officer said, we need a couple of you guys to come with us. We're going to do a signals exercise, and we're going to drive a few miles up to Chateau Tabilk, where the winery is, and pick up the wines for the officers' mess and the sergeants' mess dinners. And while we're doing that, you guys can set up a radio link back to Puckapunyal, and you'll learn lots of things about that, and we'll be off getting the supplies. What happened was that they dropped us off just inside the main gate of the winery, and they went off, and there we were. We were setting it all up, and there was what I thought was a telephone line coming quite close to me, and one of the things I had to do with setting up the communication was to get the different aerial up and over what was called like a stick sitting up, and I flung it up and it hit what I thought was a telephone line. In fact, it was an electricity line with high voltage electricity, so it was 11,000 volt. And
that's pretty high, Michael.
It's pretty high. It was only for an instant, but it was sufficient to knock me to the ground, and I couldn't move. And fortunately, the other soldier with me, Lou Baranek, said, hang on, and he grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me over the other side of the roadway.
He didn't run the risk of being electrocuted himself?
No. I had broken the connection. It had broken the connection, but it had started a grass fire at my feet. And so he saved me from being burnt in the grass fire because I couldn't move. And then he pulled me over, and that was that. And then the smoke came, and then the fire brigade arrived, and all those sorts of things happened. And then the officer and the warrant officer turned up and saying, "Oh, what have you guys been up to?" And we said, "Oh, well, it's a bit of a mistake, sir, but, this is what happened." Anyway, the net result is I had a burn on my hand, right hand, and a burn on the sole of my foot where the voltage had gone through the sole of my foot. And I was wearing hobnail boots and went straight in I was a good conductor to ground for the electricity. Anyway, because of those burns, when I got back to Puckapunyal, I was admitted to 3 Camp Hospital, which was an army hospital, and I ended up being there for 10 days. And one of the nurses in that hospital, she was a lieutenant in the nursing corps, was a girl called Kathy Lahan, whom I got to chat with and talk about, and one thing led to another, and we married after a year or two, and we were married for almost 43 years till she passed away.
So every dark cloud has a silver lining.
It does.
Michael, in those 5 or 6 years as an article clerk with Rennick and Gaynor, what sort of work did you do? I mean, I'm assuming after a certain period of time, you were effectively an independent solicitor, just working on your own with little supervision after a couple of years maybe.
Well, the article clerk's situation was, I wasn't actually, I suppose, just being a solicitor on my own because I was admitted, of course, so it all had to be under supervision. But as it turned out, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think I remembered when I actually finished, I was handling something like 200 or 300 current workers' compensation files at the time, but under the supervision of one of the partners. Brian McCarthy was the relevant partner. He went on to become, he was a well-known litigator, but went on to become a judge. But he was a fantastic principal, and he was very, very generous with his time. So I really worked for him pretty much directly for a good part of the time. But if something came up in the matter, I'd go and ask him about it, things like that sort of thing, yeah.
And mainly litigation?
Yes, it really took me into litigation. By the time I'd finished, I was sort of into litigation. But one of the things that they did when I was working there was I would work in the office of one of the partners for a few weeks at a time, not all the time, to get to know them and the type of work they were doing. And they had split it up, as you often do in a law firm. There was one partner who did just conveyancing. There was another partner who effectively did just wills and estates. And then there were Bernard Gaynor himself was very involved in industrial law and acting for a couple of trade unions and that sort of thing, very interested in politics. And then Brian McCarthy was the litigator, and he was one of the finest litigators I'd ever come across and ever would come across, I think.
One of the things that was different about those times, to my recollection, was to all firms, even I think the big commercial firms, how important conveyancing was to their cash flow, their income they earned. Conveyancing was a major part of every firm that I ever saw back in that.
Yes, that's exactly right. It was. It was a huge part of the practice, and it was one of those things where the legal profession had a monopoly on it in that sense. So it was legal work, and it had to be done by a lawyer. And we were operating in those days under the old solicitors' remuneration orders, where it was pretty much the amount of fees you charged just depended on the price of the property, not how much work you did, and whether you acted for a vendor or you acted for a purchaser or you acted for a mortgagor or a mortgagee. All those things. It was driven by those kind of cost scales. And all that's changed now, of course.
Michael, at the completion of the article clerk's course, you are admitted to practice.
Correct.
That was the process.
Yes.
And you then, after those 6 years of working for Rennick and Gaynor, you moved to Terang in the Western District.
I did.
Why did you do that?
Well, I was very interested, I think, in seeing what it would be like working as a solicitor in a regional environment. I'd never lived in the true country. I'd grown up at Smiths Gully, but that's not really the true country. It's almost an outer suburb now. But I thought it'd be interesting to try it in country practice. And my wife had been brought up in the country until her father died, and then they moved to Geelong. But she then grew up in Geelong, so she'd come from a region in any event. So we talked about it and thought that we'd give it a go. And I applied for several jobs, and one of the jobs that was available and was offered to me was to join the Terang office of Doyle and Kerr. They were solicitors who had an office in Melbourne and another office in Geelong. They'd been around for quite a while, and then they had the office in Terang. In fact, the building that was built for their office was built in 1906. So they offered me the job. We moved down there. We had our 2 young daughters. They were babies, Claire and Sarah, and I spent a couple of years working there. But we were very lucky. We had very good people we were working with. There was a solicitor called Clem Stock, who was a very senior solicitor who left the city and gone to Terang and made a real success of it. So I enjoyed working there. But I think as we moved on with the children starting to grow up and things like that, we thought maybe we might think about going back to the city, having tried it for a couple of years. And I expressed that to them. And they said, well, we'd be like to have you come back and work in the Melbourne office of our firm if you don't have anywhere else to go. And that's in fact what happened. They made that job offer and I came back to Melbourne.
In Terang, I'm assuming in a country town like that, you would basically do everything: conveyancing, probate, whatever litigation, petty crime, etc.
Exactly. Yeah, it was a general country practice. Terang's a town of 2,000 people, so it's not really big. It's half an hour's drive out of Warrnambool. So from Warrnambool's point of view, you've got the Supreme Court would come on circuit, the County Court would come on circuit. So there was the opportunity to still be involved in litigation at the higher levels. But other than that, there was the Magistrates Court in Terang, and when they closed a lot of Magistrates Courts, that one closed as well. But so we actually had a Magistrates Court in the town, and there was, I think, a sitting once a month, and then there was also a Magistrates Court at Camperdown, which wasn't very far away, and that sat more often, usually on a fortnightly or weekly basis. So I had the opportunity very early to start practising my skills as an advocate in court. I went along to my first hearing with Clem Stock doing it, and I felt very good because I was sitting next to him in the court, and he started by opening and said, "May it please your worship, my learned friend and I are going to be representing the defendant in this matter." And that was the first time I'd ever thought of myself as potentially being a learned friend of anyone. But he was very gracious and taught me a lot of the tricks in relation to it. And so I quite enjoyed being an advocate in the Magistrates Court.
But you come back to Melbourne for mainly family reasons, yes. I think, from what you said, and back to Doyle and Kerr.
Yes.
What work did you do there? Was it mainly litigation again?
Yes, it was definitely litigation. That was the reason they wanted me. They'd had a long-standing law clerk who'd been working in the firm for many years, Bill O'Callaghan, who'd done a lot of their litigation work. Not that it was a huge litigation practice, but Bill was coming to an age where he was looking at retiring. And they wanted to bring someone in who would not only take on that work but actively go out and seek further work in that space. So I did. I built that over those next few years, built up a litigation practice. So I was doing a lot of civil litigation, particularly personal injury work, but also the usual things that come across your desk. We didn't have any big people coming to us, so I wasn't acting for insurance companies or I wasn't acting for trade unions. But I got a lot of referrals from other solicitors in the city who didn't much like doing litigation, and they would just refer people to me, and then I would only act for them in those matters, and then they would go back to their former solicitors to do their conveyancing and wills and all that kind of stuff. And that worked pretty well, and I enjoyed building that up. And then I sort of slid a little bit into family law in that sense as well, because people started to say to me, "Oh, can you also do something that when I've got a client who wants to get a divorce or something like that?"
You bounced back to Terang again. You have, I think, about 7 years in Melbourne?
Yeah, I did that, and we thought about it, and the kids were starting to grow up about it, and we thought, well, maybe we'll give it another go. And it was, at that time, it was just one of those things that was worth a try again. And there was another vacancy had come up in what had been the Terang office of Doyle and Kerr, had been sold to Clem Stock, to whom I mentioned before. And he had a partner there who was intending to leave the firm, Greg Kavanagh, and in fact he did leave the firm. So that was, again, I filled in a space there, and I was there for 3 years. But sadly during that time, Clem Stock died suddenly as a result of some heart issues. And I suddenly found myself as a sole practitioner, which was interesting. We had a situation where my wife, as I mentioned, had been a nurse. And sadly, she suffered from what was in those terms called the nurse's back in the days when these young women came in to do their nursing training, and they were lifting often very heavy patients and shifting around without the proper equipment to help them do that, and they strained their backs and they paid for it in later life. And she was one of those, and so she had to have several bouts of orthopaedic surgery to deal with that, and we ultimately felt after 3 years there it was time to move back. So we were in a situation where she would have specialist medical treatment close by. And I, in fact, sold the practice to one of the Warrnambool firms.
But I think, Michael, if I've got my timing right, before you came back, there were the Ash Wednesday bushfires.
There were, just before I came back, yeah.
Which raged across the western half of Victoria.
Correct.
What was your involvement in them, or the legal outcome of them?
I had 80 farming clients burnt out in the Ash Wednesday bushfires, and there were a lot of people got burnt out in the Ash Wednesday bushfires. There were two fires. There was one fire that had caused by clashing electricity wires between Terang and Warrnambool. There was another one which had started because of a local government roadside, I suppose, little piece of equipment that's put a spark out and started a fire near Mortlake. And those fires met and then they came towards Terang. But they never got to Terang, which was good, but they burned out a lot of rural properties along the way. And ultimately, in that situation, people were saying, well, how did these fires start? Is there anywhere we could shoot at home to bring claims for compensation? And very early in the piece, because I had a litigation background, but I'd spoken to other practitioners, about 8 legal firms involved substantially to coming out of Warrnambool. But I invited them all to my home to come up and have a chat about it, because the view that I took was, look, we're all got our own clients and farming clients, and often goes back for generations and things like that. But this is a common cause. It's affected all these people. We ought to think about, as lawyers, how do we best serve our clients here? Do we all go off and run a case ourselves, or do we get together and say, can we split this up so that we're doing it in a proper way, encompassing everyone? We get the benefit of, the one counsel and all those sorts of things.
Mike, can I just clarify? At that time, there's no procedure, process, legislation in place for class actions.
No, this is before class actions.
Yeah.
So all we did at the time was we got our clients' consent to do that. We said, we're putting up this proposal that we do it this way. And we nominated 2 of the law firms to take the lead on it. And then the other law firms, of which I was one, we would deal with the damage that had happened. That was the job of the solicitor whose client it was, to do all the quantum side of it. But the 2 litigation law firms, we went ahead. We had counsel, senior counsel and junior counsel and all that stuff for actions which were then brought against the insurers of the State Electricity Commission and also the Shire of Mortlake.
And Michael, did those cases run? Were they actually running in the Supreme Court? Did you get a judgment, a result?
No, they were ultimately settled, and by the time that happened, I was pretty much exiting out to go back. But it didn't actually go to a trial. It was ultimately settled, and there were differences because of the 2 fires. They had different causes, so there was all sorts of apportionment that had to be done. But I think it was a satisfactory outcome for all the affected people concerned. Yeah.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Green's List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Green's List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
So, Michael, from the time you started as an article clerk to when you now come back to Melbourne because of Nurses Back with your wife, Kathy, I think you've been in practice pretty close to 20 years. And you have a stint, maybe the first stint, with the LIV, Law Institute. What was your role there?
That's interesting. Yes, when I came back from Terang that second time, I had to do something. So I went along to the Law Institute and spoke to the lady who worked there, who did job placement for solicitors. And I was a member of the Law Institute. And anyway, she said, well, we've got a job out in Melton where we've got a practice under consideration at the moment. Could you go and spend a week out there babysitting that for us until we decide what to do? And so I said, oh, that's fine. And I did that and came back. And then they said, oh, by the way, we're looking for an assistant director of professional conduct at the Institute. We like the work you've done out at Melton. Would that be of interest to you? And I said, sure, job's a job, and that sounds very interesting. So I took that on, and I was effectively assistant director of professional conduct. So that
Can I just clarify here? Professional conduct, is that more a regulatory a role in terms of enforcing the regulations? And
the answer to that question, Michael, is yes. The LIV was the regulator then, but we were also, the LIV was effectively the Association for Solicitors. And of course, it was that schizophrenic role of you weren't quite sure who you were kind of stuff, depending on what the matter was. But and I think that the way that's gone to a separate regulator, with the LIV being the Association for the Welfare of Solicitors, has been very much a step in the right direction, absolutely. But I was being the regulator there, or part of the regulator. But one of the things we were also doing was also providing ethics counselling to solicitors at that time. So that was the time that I got involved first in helping solicitors and answer their questions. What do I do here, or what do I do there? Have I got a conflict of interest? Have I not got a conflict of interest? That kind of stuff. So that was the first time I did it. And I was there for about 15 months. Then an opportunity came up to move on from there, where I was suggested to me that I would apply for a job with the State Electricity Commission as the Principal Legal Officer litigation, which is what I did.
You then go and start with the SEC, but it's litigation.
Correct.
Mainly personal injury litigation, people seeking damages against the SEC for things like bushfires, etc. A commercial aspect to it as well?
And no, it was when I was principal for litigation, it was more your true litigation. There were other aspects of law that were done by other people in the SEC office. So there was a solicitor, Peter McSporran, with the SEC. So he was the senior legal officer, and he dealt with all the other things that any large commercial organisation has to deal with. But I was doing litigation. You may, I think, have interviewed Deborah Coombs, who was my article clerk at Rennick and Gaynor, but she was also a senior solicitor at the State Electricity Commission, and she was the one who'd suggested to me, there's a vacancy coming up, you ought to throw your hat in the ring, which is what I did. So I came together with Deborah again at that time. The kind of litigation was mainly workers' compensation cases. There was at that time quite a lot of asbestos litigation, because as we all knew, there were dreadful cases coming out of situations where people had been exposed to asbestos in their work and then ultimately would get a very nasty disease called mesothelioma, which was always fatal and usually over 2 or 3 years. So it was the management of that kind of litigation that was involved in the work that I did, and any other litigation that came about.
And Michael, am I assuming from what you're saying that the SEC was a self-insurer?
Yes, the SEC was a self-insurer, but it was managed by an external insurance company. Yeah, but it was a self-insurer. So the work that was done was by, I think it was state insurance. That be taxing my memory a little bit on that one, Michael, but I think state insurance had a contract with the SEC and they actually managed the claims. But we were still involved as the legal people in doing the legal work, and we would take our instructions from that insurer.
And as you say, principally workers' comp.
Yes.
People working for the SEC.
Yes.
Making claims.
Yes, making workers' compensation claims or industrial accidents where there was allegations of negligence, yes.
Yeah. You stick with the electricity industry, but you become General Counsel of the Electricity Supply Association of Australia. What was that body and why did you move on there?
Can I just go back a little bit there? I was the principal legal officer, litigation at the SEC. Then Peter McSporran left the SEC to go elsewhere, and I was then appointed to be solicitor of the SEC. And that took me into another realm in doing the more general work and commercial work.
And so, Michael, how long were you at the SEC for?
Total about 3 years.
And then on to Electricity Supply Association of Australia.
Correct.
Why did that move take place?
Electricity Supply Association of Australia was the body that represented all of the major electricity companies in the country.
Who at that time were all state authorities?
Yes, they were effectively all state authorities, or some local government authorities were involved, particularly in Victoria. But essentially it was the state authorities owned by the state government. So this was before privatisation. So the ESAA represented them collectively. Then there was an issue came up where a piece of litigation occurred here in Victoria where a lady who'd worked on a State Electricity Commission site under 500 kV lines, that's 500,000 volt lines, developed a condition of leukemia and brought a workers' compensation claim and a common law claim. So it threw into stark relief the question of, is there anything happening with the power lines in terms of people's health? And that then went into litigation, and I got involved in being part of that legal team dealing with that. The reason I went to ESAA was that the view that at the time was taken, this is something that could happen anywhere, and it was best managed at a national level with everyone, basically supporting those claims if they come up elsewhere in the same way.
Well, I'm assuming that lady who brought the claim had expert opinion to say that it was caused by the high power lines or high tension lines.
Yes, she had an oncologist here in Victoria who was of that opinion. So that was important that was looked at far more closely than that. That was an opinion of a particular doctor, but all the evidence that we were seeing, most of it coming out of the United States in terms of the medical and scientific community, was that there was no link between that power line exposure to any form of cancer. And as part of that litigation, we got involved in working with American lawyers to get the expert evidence that we needed to be able to bring and have brought before the Australian courts in that space.
Was there an outcome to that? Did an Australian court, any Australian court, make a decision to say that cancer and high power lines, electricity lines, are not related?
No, it never went to litigation, and it never got anywhere. That particular case that we talked about, the lady concerned withdrew from the case after they saw the strength of the medical and scientific expert evidence. They realised that they couldn't pursue it any further, and they walked away from it. And we never saw it go, to my knowledge, to litigation. But there had been a major public inquiry in New South Wales called the Gibbs Inquiry. It was conducted by Sir Harry Gibbs, a retired Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia, in relation to a number of power lines in New South Wales. And Sir Harry had heard a lot of evidence, including experts, and had formed the conclusion that there was no evidence to support that there was a connection between power line exposure and human illness.
And your role with the Electricity Supply Association was coordinating what was happening nationwide.
Correct.
Now, Michael, you make a jump here which I couldn't quite nail down, which is from Australia to the UK. Mm-hmm. Can you just carefully take me through step by step how you wound up in the UK for about 11 years?
Well, part of the work that I was doing for the ESAA, I was also involved in an international committee that had been set up in a number of countries. It was Australia, the United States, Canada and Great Britain, all looking at the power line issue. And so I was a member of that committee for about 5 years, and then for another 5 years I was a member, but I was also a chair of it. So I was travelling a lot offshore, but I was also speaking at a lot of conferences, and I spoke at a particular conference in Vienna, and I was approached by a lady, Anne Sullivan, who worked in England in a mobile phone company. She spoke to me and said, I've been hearing you talking about the power line work you've been involved in. I work in the mobile phone industry. We're having those sorts of problems about people being concerned about the mobile phones and the masts that support the mobile phones. And I was wondering if I could speak to you about that. And one thing led to another, and we did have that conversation. And I ended up being offered a position to go to the United Kingdom, based in London, and to set up and do what I'd been doing in Australia at the ESAA in relation to the power line issue for the mobile phone issue, because they were at a point of they were about to roll out the third generation network in the UK. And there was a lot of pressure to get that system up and running because they'd paid very large sums of money to the UK government for their 20-year licences.
So, Michael, this takes us up to the end of the 20th century, about 1999, when you're approached to go and work in the UK with the mobile phone providers.
That's correct. These were the operators, yes.
It wasn't a legal job?
No.
Why did you accept the job?
Well, it was the opportunity to work offshore, I suppose. I hadn't been out of Australia until I was over 40 years old. And all of a sudden here I was being offered a job to go and work in England for several years. And Kathy and I talked about it, and our kids were very supportive of us, except my youngest daughter, Genevieve, who I think was about 19 at the time, used to say to us, I still remember the day on which my parents abandoned me to go and live in London. But it was a great opportunity in that sense for us to go and try another country and see how we liked it, and we loved it. And I ended up there for just over 10 years. I originally went for 2.5 years. Then at the end of that 2.5 years, they kept rolling the contract, and I came home in early 2010.
How would you describe the job that you did in the UK?
I was essentially an issue manager in the sense of this was an issue which was affecting the industry, and it's bringing someone in to bring issue management principles into play here and managing that issue for the industry, again on an industry-wide basis. So my organisation was the Mobile Operators Association. It was formed, but its members were essentially the 5 mobile phone operators, and the mobile phone manufacturers were kind of also, they weren't members of what I did, but they were close by and we were talking to them as well. So I was really dealing with the whole of that industry at a national level. And then I was also interacting with the organisations at an international level, because the mobile phone issue was very much an international level, but I wasn't part of them and they weren't part of me. But there was a worldwide association for them. So I was back again speaking a lot of conferences, and I was also the spokesman for the mobile phone industry on the health issue in the UK. So any issues that cropped up in the media would land in my lap, and I'd be going off and doing interviews with the media and putting the industry's situation forward. And then at the same time, we'd had a huge inquiry by Sir William Stewart on the health issue, and there was a lot going on, and the industry was putting a lot of independent research money in, being managed by universities, not by the industry itself. And we were talking to local councils on a very regular basis and the four governments of the United Kingdom about the issue, to say to them, look, this is all being managed properly. It's being managed in such a way that you as the government are happy with that, and we're happy to keep doing what we're doing. And it was a good relationship over that period of time. I got a very nice letter from the UK Minister for Health when I left to come back to Australia.
Michael, can I just clarify, when you say the issue, the issue was the perception that mobile phone towers might create cancer.
Yes, and also that mobile phones might cause brain cancer. It's a two-pronged thing. And so the mobile phones and the masts, which, carry the signals, are part of the one thing, but there's a difference in the amount of radio waves that you're getting from a mast, which is significantly less than you'll get if you're holding a mobile phone to your ear. And back in those days, people were still holding mobile phones to their ears rather than having them handheld, as they mostly are now, or just coming through sort of devices in your ear.
Michael, when you went to the UK, on my rough counting, you've been a lawyer for about 30 years. Mm-hmm. Then you had this 10 or 11-year period where, in fact, you were no longer a lawyer. Mm-hmm. Did you do any retraining? Did anyone train you in the skills you needed? Or had you picked those skills up as a lawyer?
No, I'd picked the skills up when I was at ESAA, and I'd had media training in Australia and that kind of stuff. So I'd been managing that issue in that similar kind of context. That's why the Brits thought it was a good idea. It was really just transposing across similar principles, but to a different but similar issue. But I had media training when I went to England as well. And as and when we needed it, if there was a huge media thing going on, there would be quite intensive media training about it, and that sort of went with the territory. But really, it was more about policy development. That was the key to it. It was getting the right policy, what we called as a middle ground policy, getting the right policy and persuading the government and local governments and the stakeholders generally that this was an issue that the public were concerned about, but that the industry was doing the responsible thing to address those concerns. And not a denial approach, but rather we're all in this together and we're finding as much about it as we can. We don't believe there's a problem, but we want to make sure that you, the community, are, I suppose, satisfied with the information that's out there.
Michael, you come back to Melbourne in 2010. Mm-hmm. What brought that about?
That was really brought about by the fact that my wife was quite ill at that time. She'd been diagnosed with cancer a few years earlier, and it was time to come home, is the short answer. And she did, in fact, only live for a couple of years beyond our return home. So it was the right move, and the kids, our children, were very pleased to have her back in the country, although they had visited us, as you can imagine, quite often over that 10-year period. There was always someone in the spare bedroom.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
When you come back, Michael, you hook up with the LIV again. Was there a job waiting for you? Did you apply for a job? Did someone ring you? How did that – I mean, at this stage, I assume you haven't got a practicing certificate.
I kept my practicing certificate the whole time.
Did you? You renewed it each year?
I renewed it each year. And you might ask, well, how did you do the CPD? When I was working in England, I had a large firm of lawyers, Freshfields, Brookhouse, Derringer. They're a major law firm in England, in Germany and in Europe, and they were our lawyers. So I had 10 years where whenever legal issues arose, I was the client. So I got to see what it was like being a client with a major law firm acting for you. And, your mind boggles at the size of the bills in the UK from major law firms, I can tell you. But they were terrific lawyers. But they were also very nice people and very generous. And I told them what my situation was. And they said, well, we're putting on CPD stuff for our people all the time. You're very welcome to come. It won't cost you anything. Just turn up and we'll certify you as having done your CPD training. And I used that to keep my practicing certificate going, just in case I came back suddenly for some reason.
And so how did you land back with the LIV?
Well, the story is that one day we'd been home for a while, a few months, I suppose, and one day Kathy said to me, she said, I married you for life, not for lunch. For God's sake, go out and get yourself a job. And I did. And
you wouldn't be the first husband to have that said to him by his wife.
Indeed not. But funnily enough, then the job was advertised. I saw a job advertised, and it was to work in the ethics department of the Law Institute. So I threw my hat in the ring and made the application and was interviewed and offered the job 4 days a week. It's what I've been doing ever since, pretty much, as dealing with ethics and helping the profession in those ways we've talked about before, in the counselling on the telephone, via emails, that sort of thing, and also the CPD work and the support of the ethics committee, and it's all that stuff that I'm still doing now. It's pretty much what I've been doing since 2010.
And it's busy. You're busy doing this role. It's busy. It keeps you.
Sure does. Yeah, it really is. It's a very busy role. We get about 3,000 calls a year on the ethics hotline. And then we have a number of matters coming in for ethics committee. And then the CPD training, as you would know, we're very much into CPD training, and we do it in such a way that it's very interactive, based on real life scenarios. And we got a 10 out of 10 tick from the Lawyer Ex-Royal Commission about that CPD training, as that was the gold standard to do, was to follow what the sort of stuff we were doing. And a number of other providers have now picked up on that and use it as well.
How big's the team at the LIV, Michael, doing the ethical issues or handling them?
There's about 4 of us doing just the ethics stuff as well. There is practice support done as well. I'm not personally involved in practice support. I've just been away from practical practice for too long to be doing it. But there's the colleagues there. But Simon Libbers, who is the head of ethics, of course, comes out of a conveyancing background. He's written a textbook on conveyancing. So there are other lawyers there who have those sort of skills as well. So we get, practice support questions about wills and estates, about conveyancing, all the sorts of things you do. But I think it's a really good thing for the LIV to be doing. It's been doing it for a long, long time. The Ethics Committee has been around forever. That early stint that I had at the Law Institute, there was an Ethics Committee then, and I was secretary of it then, and Justice Bernard Teague and David Miles were both on the Ethics Committee. One of them was the chairman of the Ethics Committee at that time. And so it's been, I think, very, very good for the profession right through to have the ability to seek assistance from the LIV, and particularly now as we do have a separate regulator, the regulator is now being very generous to us in increasing funding to carry out more of the training work and that kind of stuff, because I think they see us as a trusted provider of that training.
Michael, it sounds to me like that the ethical position, or your position with the LIV as an ethics lawyer, encompasses a huge amount of work and situations that come across a lawyer's desk. What about if I'm a member of the public and I'm unhappy with my lawyer? Do I ring you?
No, you don't, Michael. Who you ring is the Victorian Legal Services Board and Commissioner, which is the statutory regulator that deals with complaints from the public about solicitors that they're dealing with. And that's the appropriate body. That's the remit that they have under their statute, and that's the organisation. If a member of the public calls us, we explain that to them and then give them the details of where to make that contact, and then they go off and do that. And that works quite well because the Law Institute itself is a membership body for its members and practising lawyers, but the VLSBC is set up to assist members of the public who think that they're having a problem with their lawyer.
My recollection is when you and I first started in practice, all lawyers were a member of the LIV, but it's no longer compulsory. I can be a practicing lawyer but not a member of the LIV.
Correct.
In that situation, can I ring you? I'm not a member of the LIV, but I've got a practice.
Yes.
Can I ring you for advice?
You can in relation to in any ethical matter, not a problem at all. But in terms of practice support, theoretically you need to be a member of the LIV to do that, to get that kind of advice. But sometimes you'll be speaking to someone and they'll ask you a question about ethics and then they ask you a question about practice support. We don't cut them off if they're not a member of the LIV. I mean, at the end of the day, the LIV is working for its members. We hope that it's providing a good service to its members, and we're encouraging people to sign up because there are all sorts of benefits, and that's just one of them.
Do you know what percentage of Victorian lawyers are members of the LIV?
I'm sad to say no, I don't know the exact number, but it'd be quite a number. I mean, the membership is over 20,000, and that's quite a lot for a lot of lawyers in one form or another, spread across private practice and government and corporations. And it's a growth area, and I think the LIV, as having just been presented with a certificate for having been a member of it for 50 years, I think it's a great organisation, apart from being my employer.
Michael, thank you for coming in this morning and telling us about what I find a most fascinating journey, and I think a unique journey in the law, yours, from an article clerk to Terang in the Western District, SEC, UK, now the LIV. It's been unique, as I say. I can't think of anyone else who would have had a journey like yours. Do any parts of it stand out to you as the most satisfying for you?
Yes, it does, Michael. I mean, I think that I've been so lucky to have all those experiences over that long period of time. And I think it's all come home to roost really back at the LIV doing the ethics work. I've really enjoyed doing the ethics work and continue to enjoy doing the ethics work. And I think that's been the real highlight for me, because it's brought together a whole number of other strands that I've learnt along the way. And I think it's the most satisfying. I think in terms to be able to speak to a legal practitioner about a matter that's concerning them as far as their ethical obligations are concerned is very, very satisfying. Talking to lawyers and helping them with those kind of issues are the highlights of my day, the highlights of the days of my colleagues. That's what we all come to work to do, is to help our fellow practitioners in those areas. So that's a big plus for us. I would be lying if I didn't say that the 10 years plus that I spent in the UK wasn't great. It was terrific because it gave an opportunity to travel a lot closer to Europe than it is going from Australia. So that was enjoyable to be able to do that and to meet other people in other countries and discuss these kind of issues. That's been fascinating to meet people from around the world on a similar issue at any one time. So, yeah, I've just been very, very lucky, and I'm very, very grateful for having had that opportunity, and I hope I can continue doing it for a while to come yet.
Michael, thank you for coming in this morning and sharing your journey with us.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Mark.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greens List clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.